Right guys, how's it going? Welcome back. I've noticed a lot of customers coming into my garage tend to have a budget of around £3,000 for an outright purchase, rather than going down the finance route. I know this is true because I have a forecourt mostly filled with cars at that price point. That's no coincidence, I've done this job for too long. Studies suggest that people are comfortable spending between 10 and 15% of their annual income on a used car, so the £3,000 price point does make sense. But just because you've only got £3,000 to spend on a used car, does that mean you've got to be all boring and sensible? Well, I don't think so. And today I've compiled a list of 10 used cars for £3,000 or under, which I think are quite interesting. Don't worry, by the way, this list isn't filled with silly luxury barges that'll cost a fortune to keep on the road. I have been quite sensible, I think. Right, let's get started. So, the first one on the list then is the Audi TT Mark II. Now the Audi TT has been around since 1998, but the early ones, unless you can find a Minter, will be a bit long in the tooth, so I'd recommend a nice Mark II. Now the second generation TT came out in 2006, and for £3,000 you will get yourself a decent example. Although they're only a small car, they're a 2+2, they're quite practical. The rear seats fold down completely, and you'd be surprised how much stuff you can get in the boot. For £3,000 you'll get yourself a petrol example. Now, one word of warning, I would go for a manual rather than an automatic. The automatics can be troublesome, so you're better off with a manual. They're more fun as well. They're available with front wheel drive or all wheel drive. They're a stylish looking thing, the interiors are really high quality, and they're good fun to drive. So if you want something sporty for your £3,000, then look no further than the Mark II TT. Right, number 2 on this list is the Mini. Now I'm talking here specifically about the new generation Mini from 2001, the BMW Mini. Before you call me a hypocrite, I have mentioned in previous videos they can be quite unreliable. They've usually got some engine issues or gearbox issues. But I've done this job long enough and I'm wise enough to know that that doesn't happen with every single model. If you can find yourself a nice Caird, for example, then you should be fine. Just make sure the gearbox doesn't whine when it's in gear or crunch when you're changing gears. Make sure the engine isn't tappety and there's no warning lights on, and you should be okay. One reason I'm not a massive fan is because they're quite heavy. The steering's heavy, the door handles are heavy, everything's quite tight and stiff. But on the other side of the coin, that is a bit of a selling point because they're really good fun to drive. I'd recommend going for something like a 1.6 Cooper. I don't think you'll get a decent Cooper S for £3,000, so just stick with a regular Cooper. It should come reasonably kitted out as well. Most had leather, air conditioning, things like that. I think they've aged really well. They looked cool when they came out and they still look cool now. They're easy to park and they are really good fun to drive. They handle really well. Number 3 on this list, you'll want to listen out for this one if you want something more luxurious. It's the Jaguar S-Type, but specifically the S-Type diesel. Now I'm not a big diesel fan, but like I said at the start of this, I'm trying to be sensible. So the 2.7 litre turbo diesel V6 is quite a good engine in the S-Type, especially if you do plenty of motorway miles. That same engine when used in Land Rover Discovery 3s and Range Rover Sports can have issues, but in the Jaguar S-Type, they're usually pretty good. You'll probably average around 28 miles per gallon around town and 42 or 44 on a motorway run, so they are quite frugal. They're quite punchy as well because it's a V6. Now I really like the Jaguar S-Type, I've had dozens of them. They're good cars in my opinion. You get so much car for the money. One thing to mention about that turbo diesel V6 though, it is belt driven, not chain driven, so make sure it's had the cam belt done. I think they're due every 8 years or 105k, so do make sure that's been done. Now I know styling's subjective and not everyone likes that front grille, but I really like it. I think they're an elegant looking car. And on the inside of the S-Type, it's just a really nice place to be. The seats are really comfortable, you get loads of optional extras, they're just good cars. So if you've got £3,000 to spend, that's an interesting option. The good thing about the S-Type is that it's new enough to live with on a daily basis. It'll still have all those luxuries that you've grown accustomed to, such as heated electric seats, one of those quick clear windscreens, cruise control, all that sort of stuff. Before we continue with this list, I just need to say a big thank you to today's video sponsor. Today's video is sponsored by Surfshark. If you want to protect yourself while you're shopping online or doing online banking, then you really need to check out Surfshark. They're a VPN service provider. It protects you so that all your data and your details and your IP address are hidden, so cyber thieves can't view it. In addition to that handy feature, it blocks malware, phishing, ads and other kinds of nastiness, which in turn can speed up your bandwidth and make your device stream things much more quickly. The last thing I want to do is get my card details stolen or my bank details hacked, and since I've been using Surfshark, touch wood, that just hasn't happened. Another good thing about Surfshark is you can change your location settings so you can watch your favourite content from online streaming services like Netflix. You know how sometimes you want to watch a show or a film and it says it isn't available? Well, with Surfshark you can change your location settings so that it thinks you're in a different territory. Then all of a sudden it becomes available. You can download the app very easily from the App Store and you can use it on multiple devices. It's cheap and easy to use. We're all online a huge amount of time these days, so you just don't know how much information you're putting out there, so it's better to be protected rather than not. Especially if you frequently use insecure public Wi-Fi spots such as at airports, train stations and other places. If you're interested in checking out Surfshark and you want to get an even better deal, then use my promo code HighPeakAutos and you'll get 3 months extra totally free. Or click the link below in the video description. Or visit surfshark.deals/HighPeakAutos. And thanks Surfshark for sponsoring today's video. Moving on, this one's a bit of an oddball choice, but I couldn't not include it. It's the Alfa Romeo GT. Now I had a look at Breras, but you can't really find any nice Breras for around £3,000. But the Alfa GT on the other hand, there are plenty of them out there, and they're such a stunning looking car. Now I should confess at this point, I've never actually had an Alfa Romeo GT, I've just always admired them from afar. But for £3,000 I'd certainly be tempted. Unfortunately then that means I don't have any expert advice for you. But just do your homework. If you go for one of the diesels, they're a JTD. They're quite a reliable engine. Just make sure it's had its cam belt done and regular servicing. If you go for one of the petrols, they're quite good as well. I've had all kinds of Alfa petrols in my life, but never had anything too serious go wrong. The other good thing about Alfa Romeos is that they tend to have been owned by enthusiasts who've looked after them properly. That's been my experience anyway. Your average person on the street that just wants a car to get from A to B doesn't necessarily buy an Alfa Romeo. They're always bought by, well, a petrol head. So with that in mind, you should be able to find a decent example, and it's just quite an interesting choice because you rarely see them. Now speaking of interesting choices, number 5 on the list is the Chrysler 300C. Now I quite like these. They're not the best car in the world, don't get me wrong, but for £3,000 you could do far worse. Now they do a couple of big V8s, but what I'd recommend is one of the 3.5 V6s, because they're quite reliable engines, or even better yet, the 3 litre CRD. Now that's a Mercedes engine and they're quite reliable. They can have issues with leaking oil coolers and things like that, but generally they're a chain-driven unit and they will do the miles. They're all automatic and they all come loaded with extras, so you'll get heated leather seats, electric seats, all that sort of stuff. A lot of them came with that Boston Premium Audio as well, which sounds really good. What I'd recommend you go for actually is the Estate. I think the Estates look quite cool. They're actually exactly the same as the Dodge Magnum, which we never got here, but I still think they look quite cool. If you need a practical, sensible family estate car, again, you could do far worse. In terms of running costs, it is quite a big engine that, so you'll be doing probably 24, 25 round town and probably 36, 38 on a motorway run. I had a quick look on Auto Trader this morning and £3,000 will get you a decent example. Now if you want something a bit more fun, number 6 on the list is the Mazda 3 Sport. Now again, I really rate these. I've had loads of these in my time. I recommended one to my pal who bought one and then that was involved in an accident and then he went out and bought another. They do them in a hatchback or a saloon, both look quite cool. They have a 2 litre petrol engine and they come with loads of optional extras. So you'll get Bose audio, bright xenon lights, loads of things like that. It just makes it a bit easier to live with. Again, it's from that era of cars that I like most, so it isn't too old that you can't really daily drive it, but it isn't too young that it's going to, blow your budget. My only one gripe with those is they're only a 5-speed manual, and it could have really done with a 6th gear. I noticed every time I was out with my mates on the motorway at 70 miles an hour, you'd be doing 3,500 RPM. It could have really done with an extra cog, but it's not the end of the world really, and for £3,000 you will get yourself a nice example. They're a chain-driven engine, so there are no belts to replace. The only thing that you need to watch out for really is rust. They can rust quite badly, so just make sure it's got a good MOT history. Make sure there are no advisory items for corrosion and things like that. But I just couldn't do a list like this and not include the Mazda 3 Sport. It's a really good all-rounder. It's good to drive, it looks the part, it's quite practical, it's quite sensible to run. It's got a lot going for it. Right, next up on the list, number 7 is another quirky one. It's the Subaru Legacy Tourer. You hardly ever see these cars, but they're really good. They tend to have been owned by the same owner for about 15 years. Once somebody buys a car like this, they've just got no reason to ever get rid of it. The petrol engines are strong, the gearboxes are good, they're good fun to drive, and they're just interesting. And that's what this list's all about. For £3,000, you'll get something like a 2007, 2008 with under 100,000 miles on the clock. With Subaru in general, you do want to avoid the diesels, you can have some serious issues, but the petrols are pretty bulletproof. Again, the other good thing with Subaru, a bit like Alfa Romeo, they tend to have been owned by an enthusiast, which means it should have been serviced regularly. They do a Subaru Legacy Saloon as well, but I'd recommend the Tourer. The estate version is just way more practical. So if you're looking for one, make sure it's got full service history, make sure the cam belt's been done, all that sort of stuff. Now, while we're still in Japan, number 8 on the list is the Lexus IS. Now, for £3,000, you'll get yourself quite a nice Mark 1 or a high mileage Mark 2, and they're both really good. The Mark 1's much more of a driver's car. The manual gearbox on that is just really good, as are the engines. Again, you need to make sure the cam belt's been done, and it's been serviced regularly, and it's got a clean MOT because they can rust. But they have the best instrument cluster I've ever seen, they look really good, and they sound good too. But regarding the Mark IIs, if you can find yourself a nice one, what I'd recommend is a nice IS250. Avoid the diesels are rubbish. But the IS250, which ran from 2005 onwards, they're really solid cars. They're a chain-driven engine. They're a little bit thirstier than you'd hope. It'll do probably 22 around town and maybe 32 on a run. So they're not the cheapest to run. But what they lack in fuel efficiency, you'll get back in luxury and reliability. When I say you'll only find a high mileage Mark II, when I looked on Autotrader this morning, I found some with 125 on, 135. So not, I'm not talking 200,000 miles, I'm just talking 130, 140. And that with a used Lexus wouldn't put me off. If there's one car that can do the miles, it's an IS. Now the next car to feature, the penultimate one on this list, is a bit of a weird one. You probably have never even seen one or heard of it. It's a Cadillac SRX. Now you'll be lucky to find one of these because they were quite rare, hardly anybody bought them. But for £3,000, it's a really interesting car. They come with a 3.6 litre V6, which goes well and sounds nice. And typical of an American car, it'll come with every single conceivable extra. Now although it's an awful lot of car for the money and it's a 7-seater, there are a few negatives that you need to be aware of. Fuel wise, you'll be doing 17, 18 around town and 27, 28 on a motorway run. Road tax is high and parts might be quite tricky to get hold of. Still, I thought I'd mention it. Right, the last on this list then is a little bit of a quirky one. You might think now that I'm not exactly ending on a high, but I quite like these. It's the Citroën Berlingo Mark I. Essentially what this is a French van, but they do one called a multi-space, which is a car. Well, it's a van with seats in. And they're a really practical, quirky thing, especially if you've got a young family or you're an outdoorsy type. There are just no limits to its versatility. I've actually had a few of these. I drove one once all the way from Spain back to the UK. That was a 1.9 litre non-turbo diesel, so it was quite slow. But it's just such a characterful car and engine. You could run these things on chip fat oil. It'll just run forever. As I've mentioned in many previous videos, I'm not a big fan of French cars. I don't think they're very reliable. But this era of French car, especially the diesels, they just run forever and ever and ever. You go to North Africa and this is all you'll see. They facelifted the Berlingo in 2003 and fitted a turbo to the diesel engine. But what I'd really recommend is one of the early ones. Again, that might not be the idea of something you want to run around in every single day, but for £3,000 it is certainly quite interesting. Think of it as a 90s, early 2000s Skoda Yeti. That's the best way to look at it. Well, I think that concludes my quirky car list. I think there's something there for everybody. And any of those cars that I've just mentioned are definitely more interesting than driving an old Astra or Focus. But if you've got any suggestions or you can think of something better, then let me know below in the comments. Right guys, thank you once again for watching. Make sure you give the video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't done already. You can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter and TikTok. I'll leave the link below. And yeah, see you next time.